I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for.
So, Jeff, I really loved the example you gave of the immune system as something that knows. It is able to recognize patterns, but then you can have like a protein on the bacteria that looks like a protein in the body, and now you have arthritis. But is human intelligence like that too?
There's a certain extent to which, all of us are just kind of spitballing when we say stuff like that. When we speculate on these kinds of things, I think, we always need to sort of hold our pet theories with an open hand, because I mean, even neurobiologists and cognitive, science specialists, they're still on the cutting edge of figuring out what is this actual thing.
Right.
How does meat work when it tries to know how does meat know things? But I think there's always a strong temptation to analogize our systems for dealing with complexity to the ways that we deal with complexity. Mm-hmm. And I think the corollary to that is it's also easy to reduce what humans do, or any thinking creatures do, to the terms of the systems that we've built. Like, I can't remember the name of it, but there's a book that I've just been reading about like the one of the things that it talks about is the history of like how of things that humans have invented and then used to describe this is how people work. Like everything from plumbing to engine to like combustion engines to gears and mechanical things to then computers and now artificial intelligence. We're like, yes, truly, this is how people work. And like you look at a century or so ago, people saying, the combustion engine, and you get more metaphors suddenly about how, food is the fuel that your body burns for things. It's like, yeah, but micronutrients, it's not just that. Like, there's that temptation to sort of go reductionist and say, this particular aspect of what we do and how we do it produces certain, behaviors or outcomes. And now we've made a thing that does a certain thing and produces those outcomes. So we have now made what we do. We've duplicated that. And I've seen I won't say a lot of people, but at least a critical mass of enough people casually making the argument in Reddit threads and Twitter and, the occasional op-ed and stuff like that. And, even, CEOs of AI companies saying things like, taking in patterns and matching patterns and producing outputs based on those that's all humans do, just a little more complicated. It's sort of like the taxonomy game. It's like if you're willing to collapse behavior to pattern matching, you can articulate a taxonomy for human activities and behaviors that uses that, and you can say, yes, and my new SaaS platform too can do all of these 9 things that my taxonomy of human activities can do. Thus, we've duplicated this. But that's more a reflection of the taxonomy than how humans work. And we talk about how we're pattern matching machines, but not in quite the same sense. And I think even if we were ever to manage to duplicate humans in a system, even just reducing it conceptually to the, hey, there's this bucket of, we're a bucket of stimulus getting poured in and patterns being matched between them and stuff coming out. Well, the actual human experience involves such a huge range of different kinds of stimulus than just language. Like, language is an artifact of all of the stuff that humans do, not the thing that humans do. It is a distinctively human thing that we do a lot of, but like collapsing humanness to the use of language, and thus you could duplicate a human given enough language. It's like that. I think that confuses the artifact with the thing that produces it. And like, this comes back to the same thing that, Karen and I talk a lot in content when, organizations are trying to plan their content in a more strategic way. Like, content fundamentally is communication, not a podcast or a page or, something like that. Like, it is a message with a particular intent and a particular audience. And the goal is to produce particular outcomes in that audience via the handing over of this artifact. And it conveys a thing, but its effectiveness is sort of dependent on how well does it get that outcome to happen. That's not inherent in the thing. That's a thing that occurs between the audience and the communicator via this thing, and thus purely collapsing it to the artifact itself. It's like that wipes out what's happened, like the actual real thing that is occurring when language gets used, and looks at the artifact as the thing itself. And it's like, there's so much amazing stuff we can do using these tools, but like, I feel like even to come close to replicating full human capability, you'd have to say like, oh, well, we made a thing that can make noises and hear noises and do words, and also has a range of sensory input, and maintains its own cumulative internal state and has a culling process for it, and also is mobile and can locomote, and it has an endocrine system that affects the operation. It's like there's so many aspects of the system that exert real meaningful impact on what a human does, that you could say, oh well, we barely even have free will, we're just these bag of chemicals walking around and doing stuff. It's like, okay, but like it's still pretty darn hard to make a flow chart that actually reproduces the complexity of human behavior.
but that is the strange loops between the different layers of really trying to replicate humans. I think is a loser's game. I think that the only thing we can do is to create an alien that we can share artifacts with. Well, there's a signal boundary systems also in complexity. Yeah. So
is that like the idea of like, there's the system itself, and then there's the boundary line where you're not really participating in the system, you're just getting signals about what's going on in the system that you can respond to? Or
it's like this it's this pattern in living systems that you see repeated over and over again, like immunity. Like, there's a bunch of signals, there's a boundary, there's the cell membrane, there's the nuclear membrane. So like every time you have this, it's a separation, but not fully separated. So there's the ability to still communicate with what's outside, but you create a space where you can create a far from equilibrium state that's unique, that does something different.
The pattern language stuff, domain-driven design has like the concept of a domain language.
Yeah.
And its concept of a domain language is essentially that kind of boundary line where there's an internal language inside of the domain that does its own thing. And then outside of the boundary, there's a subset or a shared language that can be used for interfacing, but it doesn't have to bear the responsibility of everyone speaks every internal language of every system. Back to the caching concept.
Yeah. Or like the normalization of all information.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's what we try to do with semantic web, right? That was we're going to normalize everything. And it's really, I was thinking back about like semantic web. So if you look at semantic web and what we were trying to do back then, well, actually it's already to some extent, schema.org is a continuation of that effort. But like, how does it interplay with LLMs or with this, let's call it like the AI effort? Yeah. But to bring it back to that caching, it's a standardization effort, I think, that makes it easier for both humans, but also for machines to do more useful things with that information that you're sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I want to go and try if we can use LLMs or AIs to map like less structured content into a structure, to put it in a straitjacket and see how well it functions. And can you automate that? Can you automate the process of you can, like we know that you can do embedding, you can do entity extraction and stuff like that. So I imagine that we will be able to just take a body of customer support and then extract frequently asked questions from it, which is kind of straightforward, but then maybe also more complex things, and then encode that so that you, instead of having to process all of, like having to index all of that customer support history, you can like condense it into, here's the full list of all the things that mattered. And now
I like, and this is the challenge that I think we face. Like, once this is sort of like will we stop needing CMSs, or will we just have different things be doing CMSing? Like,
we're going towards a CMS. So we had the CMS that was adapted to the Git database. We had the CMS that was adapted to the decoupled front end. Now we're going to have a CMS adapted to AI. And what does that look like?
So, like, I would argue that the process you've described is indistinguishable from indexing. Like, are we eliminating the need to index all that stuff, or have we just made a more powerful indexing tool that we can use? I think like LLMs as a category are the biggest indexing system we've ever smacked a problem with, and it's incredible and amazing at that, and its facility at certain kinds of things that we previously thought were only possible using, quote, intelligence or whatever, is a lesson to us how much is embedded in our artifacts and how indexing mechanisms can result in outcomes that are very complicated and unpredictable. But like, fundamentally, they're doing the work of mass indexing and cross-referencing rather than, any other metaphor that we might, bring to the table to try to describe it. And I think the more we treat it like that, the closer we get to reproducibility and effective application of LLM tools, because it's like it keeps it in the realm of using the tool for what it actually does, rather than the secondary outcomes that statistically emerge from it most times, if the inputs and outputs are right. Like, the more we treat it as like a shockingly, staggeringly capable indexing mechanism, the more useful that is. I think somebody described like the concept of an LLM as like it's a compression tool. It doesn't store human knowledge any more than a JPEG stores a perfect copy of an original analog photo. It compresses it and inherently discards huge swaths of information that, for the application intended, are not actually necessary. But you start pushing it and suddenly you go, oh my gosh, there's artifacting, and oh my gosh, well, there's color shifting. It's like, well, yeah, that's the nature of the beast. This isn't just a thing that magically makes big things smaller. Yeah. It's doing these processes in order to make it possible to store X in this in this space. And like LLMs do the same thing. Like it's a process of us discovering how much of what we do and communicate and shuffle around in artifacts has patterns in it. And how patterny a lot of what we do is. And like, as we stay in that zone, it can be a very powerful tool. But like, that's the category error that I keep seeing lots of folks make, is like, oh, well, this will figure out X for us. Oh, well, this will find things for us. It's like, I mean, it's like, if people have asked stuff like that before, or if the language you're using has been used to articulate this kind of problem before, it will be able to probably find similar patterns of communication and get you onto that track. But like, it's not, in one sense, it's not doing what humans do, which is taking in a message and internalizing it as this internal conceptual representation of the world that we exist in, and the full sensorium of experience and stuff like that, and then making a new message that is an artifact of a desire to communicate a thing and get another person to change their internal state. And it's like, language is like these packets we hurl back and forth at each other to try to do those things in dialogue. And that isn't what LLMs are doing. They're looking at the packets and reproducing patterns in the packets that, because of how humans work, often follow certain chains and sequences, because if someone asks this, it's often answered by this or whatever. Like, there are really meaningful patterns in there, but like, and I guess in my head I'm still chewing on that question you asked of, is this what we do? And it's like, it's what we produce, but it's not necessarily what we do. It's the, like, what's going on internally inside of an LLM is a pattern comes in and it ripples from there. And, there's internal states that it has, but those states are about probability rather than intention of the thing. But that brings us back to, do humans have free will, or are we just giant chemical, responders or whatever? But like, at the very least, humans are doing that responding at a level that is galactic orders of magnitude beyond what we can efficiently reproduce. Like, what we throw a nuclear reactor and 6 months of, LLM training at, and a warehouse full of NVIDIA cards at is, and the result of that is a thing that is hundreds of orders of magnitude less capable than a human being when answering the same questions. It's like, it's Twix bars and cocaine can keep a human, grad student cruising at a much lower per query cost than an LLM. But the grad student scales poorly, and it's there's all sorts of complexity associated with that. But like, we can get it to do certain things, but that like big picture thing of, could I ask it to go learn how to do X and then come back next week and help me with that.
Yeah.
Like, that's not what's going on in that thing.
It's really interesting what you said, that AI is just basically the best indexing machine we've ever built.
I mean, and that's just as reductive as a lot of the stuff I, critique other people about, but
that's really interesting, because then that could maybe show us like what is the new kind of CMS that we can build with this thing.
Like how do we work more directly with the patterns and structures rather than treating those as like an extra layer that we bolt on top of things? Or how do we? Maybe I think I know. I was like, okay, so one of the challenges that we work with a lot is people who've been using arbitrary pattern-based page builders, modular page builders to assemble stuff. And functionally, in the day-to-day operations of their companies or their project or their teams, there are patterns of use that emerge in how they put those things together that have important meaning, but that meaning is implicit rather than explicit. And thus, it's very difficult to actually tease out what is really going on. Like, so you've just got, one giant type of content that you dump everything into. Well, we've got documentation pages, and we've got interviews, and we've got product pages and stuff like that. What makes a thing an interview page versus what makes it a product page versus what makes it documentation in that kind of scenario is this sort of hazy, implicit intent, but patterns can emerge given sufficient volume. And making, like, one of the things that we've talked about is starting to shift from a content type in a CMS being a prescriptive schema that is designed and codified and enforced, and becoming a descriptive process by which you say, in our pool of stuff, things that open with a quotation and follow up a cadence of question and answer from one speaker to another speaker. We call those interviews. And anything that fits that pattern, once we've described it, becomes an interview just by virtue of having described it. Now, the things that match it are interviews, not because we went in and we toggled a flag on each record and said, now this is interview or something like that, but that descriptive approach to content, it would be a significant shift, but it seems to fit how more and more organizations are actually starting to are doing stuff in this world of assembled pattern-based content. Now, it still relies on the lower level atomic vocabulary of, oh, well, I said a question and an answer and a speaker and a quotation. In order to make that query that creates interview, you still need some sort of mechanism to codify what is a speaker, what is a question, what is an answer, what is a quotation. But you can then build on top of those granular elements in a richer way, where something could be an interview and a feature article and documentation, if in fact if one thing fits the described qualities of all of those things, it is all three of those things inherently. And I think that would be a significant shift in how we approach certain kinds of how we approach structured content. I personally think that's emerging as something we are going to have to build towards as a capability in order to support the real world usage patterns that people are engaging in.
There's something called self-constraining, like molecules in a liquid. they're like a vortex that starts when you open the tap, when you open the sink and the water drains, then you have this vortex that emerges, which is a dynamic self-constraining pattern, and it's the molecules that are constraining each other. And it feels that language is like that also, because they're
things like grammar
Yeah.
impose like language is not just, well, ironically, because a bag of words is actually a tool in natural language processing, but language is not just a bag of words.
Yeah.
Syntax and structure are those enabling constraints that allow things to click together in ways that work and make sense. And like the difference between a boy rode the bicycle and the boy rode a bicycle, same set of words, but one is about a boy doing something and one is about a bicycle and something is happening to that bicycle.
Yeah.
Just by taking two subtle little words and shifting their positions, you get different semantic meaning. And those rules, like, they matter beyond just the individual molecules.
So this dynamic self-constraining enables us to be ambiguous in our meaning, and through the ambiguity carry more meaning in the same message. Like when you are reducing a set of knowledge into a documentation or like a structured documentation, you reduce the ambiguity, which accelerates the processing of it, and also makes it less uncertain, or it makes it more certain that people will actually understand what you wanted to say. But at the same time, something's lost.
Well, so coming back to your analogy of the caching layer, it's like inherent in the concept of a caching layer is that you've preserved an intermediary state in order to make things faster or more efficient, but it's not the same as that distant thing, either because it might change and you need to reflect that, or because you've simplified something to only preserve what you needed for a certain conversation or a certain option or whatever. But explaining to someone how to use an API and the interface of that API doesn't necessarily automatically convey a full understanding of all the operation of the system as a whole.
Or the affordances.
That's a whole nother discipline, even,
I'm still hung up on that AI as a caching machine. And what does that change? So LLMs as this magical indexing machine does not necessarily need structured content. It doesn't need it to be like indexes before, like in a database, you needed the structured content because, there's like NoSQL databases or like the same with async APIs or with messaging queues where you have like whatever you want, as long as it's a discrete unit of text that's being sent at a certain time, we don't care, we'll just store it. But then if you actually want to use that for a useful purpose, you have to start constraining it, and you apply an async API specification on top of it that now filters out only those messages that adhere to certain pattern that you're looking for. And now those you can use to create a graph about usage or because you had a whole bunch of messages coming and only part of it were actually useful for constructing that graph. What does it all mean? Well, I'm still chewing on this. What is the CMS that we're going to create for the new AI paradigm? What is the new kind of content? So if everything is a content management system, then what is this new type of content management system that is going to emerge to take advantage of this new magical indexing capability? Basically, we've created a global index.
I think my guess, my speculative, spitballing is
that's what we're here for.
CMSs that make it easier and more integrated into the mental model of the CMS user. to capture and codify important connective connective aspects of things, and to work directly with those connective aspects of things in a way that doesn't feel like I'm juggling 16 balls in the air just to edit this page.
Yeah.
And manually doing the legwork of pulling it all together, like things that make it easier to do that.
I actually have an example for it. A friend of mine is one of the co-founders of Superface, which is basically they're trying to build like a super interface for accessing any kind of API. But the demo that he showed me now that they built using an LLM is that you just speak a message into or you write a message, or you dictate a message. Just come off a call with a customer. You dictate a message. I've just had this conversation with this person from that company. It looks like we have an opportunity here. I think it's about this amount of money. These are the things that we're going to do. So you just blurb out whatever comes out of your mouth. And then it will go and look for the things that fits the patterns. Like, oh, this looks like an opportunity that I'm going to squirrel away in the CRM. This is a new account. I'm going to add that to our CRM. This is a new lead. I'm going to add it into CRM. And there's a task here. I need to schedule a meeting. Here's the meeting that I can schedule for you. And it just pulls out all of those jobs that need to be done, and it gives them back to you and asks you, like, do you want me to do all of these things? And then you say yes, and it just goes away and scrolls away. So this, just dump your information, and the system extracts the structured information out of it, stores it, and then makes that available to interact again in an unstructured way.
And like I think you can see threads of that all throughout the emergence of what we sort of talk about as like modern, computing and digital stuff. Like I know, like the old Apple Newton way back in the day, one of the things that I always thought was really fascinating about how it worked under the hood was it didn't have any concept of documents. Like even, you never worked with documents. You had what was called a data soup, which was just these free-floating typed entities of things like a person and an address or a note that could mention a person if you used the same name in the content of the note, or like all of those things, or you could ask for directions, which was just using a particular like just mapping addresses you had onto a new set of things to do with them. But under the hood, like what you were storing in your Newton was just this soup of typed free-floating entities. And I think we've gotten very close from a technology standpoint to like the science of storing and manipulating and transforming things that we have in that format.
Yeah.
The challenge is in how do we operate on those things? Like how do people operate on those things and work with them casually when there is a free-floating soup of all these atoms isn't the natural paradigm of anybody except knowledge graph enthusiasts, for actually thinking about like a memo or something like that. And I think the promise of an excitement around LLMs is that sort of generalizability that they bring, because like what they're trained to do is take language and, find matching patterns. And, if what you're telling it to go do is a common enough pattern that it's able to match with, it can actually go and run and it can produce outputs that match what you want to accomplish. But like under the hood, when we start talking about operationalizing that on a larger and larger scale, or doing it in domains where there isn't really sufficient training data to just let the generalized language capabilities get close enough, like in those areas where somebody has to actually do it, and like whether it's calling out different aspects of the client opportunity, that you mentioned, or figuring out who needs to be contacted or something like that. Better tools for operating directly and indirectly on that soup of connective tissue, I think, are really lacking. Like, the easiest to use tools are ones that paper over the fact that underlying soup of stuff is even there and let you pretend that it's just a page or something like that, which can make aspects of it easier, but the ripple effects of, but actually under the hood, we're storing this giant interconnected system of stuff can be really difficult for people. Like, I edited this and this changed. That's not what I wanted to happen. What should be done? How do you make affordances that allow people to navigate layers of that in easy and clear ways, and in ways that are task and context appropriate? Like, I don't think that AI is ever going to magically solve that, because what it can do is follow patterns that exist, but much in the same way that designing the concept of a doorknob as a tool for unlatching and moving a door is a design question, not a pattern following question. Like, I think figuring out better ways to help people operate on that connective soup of stuff that they are expected to work with is kind of the next frontier for content management.
So basically, like, your CRM is a very specific context in which you have a certain well-defined set of structures that allows you to, it's like a far from equilibrium space where certain things can happen. Like, you can go and look up a lead and see how likely they're about to land or something like that. But then the translation from, it's kind of like how mitochondria work in a cell, where you have, like, food comes in, gets digested, like some molecules are taken into the cell breaks it down, it creates either fats or pyruvates, and then it burns it. But it's like taking this unstructured mess, trying to select out the structured pieces that it can actually handle, and then shipping it to the right place to handle it. And then it gets really efficiently handled by that thing. And then it comes back with, like, something other structured thing that then can be used for some other process. So is that the function of large language models, this breaking down and translating and, like...
I think at the very least, the breaking down.
Yeah.
I think, I think whether it's large language models or small language models, the sort of, this architecture of you take input and you break it down into these fundamental patterns that get you sort of heuristically close to known things, and then you just take operations based on that or whatever, rather than trying to do precise one-to-one matching against keywords and stuff like that. I think that approach fits that breaking it down step. I think that as we demand more and more of the systems, assuming that the LLMs will also handle the routing and the processing and, like, the other stages of that, becomes a worse and worse assumption, because of, like, the nature of the beast there is that they can only really do what they've watched be done.
Yeah.
And that may be in tiny bits or in big patterns, and thus, if they've seen enough tiny patterns, they could assemble it into new big patterns, but fundamentally all they can do is follow what they've watched be done. I think that processing and, acting upon step is always going to be very risky for statistical heuristic models as represented by the current wave of AI stuff. The language is always a little hazy because, somebody's always pressing the boundaries of what a system can do, sometimes by bolting on completely new kinds of things and making them work together. But I think that, the digestive aspect of it, to use that and to keep with that analogy, I think is very similar to how parsing, tokenizing, vector, turning things into vectors. It's that digestive process.
Yeah.
But then how much more, we made this big breakthrough on that. And now there's this big open field in front of us of how do we tackle operationalizable problems of that second and third and fourth step in the process.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the tools to allow people to operate on and work with the connective tissue is important, because if we just depend on the models to make sense of it, things like what connections are they making is always essentially out of reach for us. And the ability to go in and say, oh no, well, this means this. And when I mentioned so-and-so, I didn't mean them, I meant their capacity in this particular role or whatever. The ability to sort of drop down a level and directly operate on those things as part of the meaningful body of knowledge, I think is going to become more and more critical as systems get built out on top of these kinds of representations of reality, because relying on statistical associations to handle all of that, it's great for that ingest process. Yeah. But right now, if you ask an LLM a question, all you can do is ask it again or rephrase it. Or if you correct it, you're not getting it to correct what happened. You're giving it a new derivative path. Just that's what's literally mechanically happening in the guts of the LLM. You're not correcting it. You're making a new derivative path. And that's why you can get an LLM to apologize for making an error. And that doesn't mean it now knows it made a mistake. It means it recognizes that when someone corrects someone, an apology is a common response to that. And delivering the same response as it first did is a very uncommon response statistically when a thing that is shaped like a correction is given. It's that can get us close to certain things, but there isn't a way to dip in and say, oh no, I meant this. Because right now, that's a giant web of thousands of vectors, and we don't even know what the vectors are directly connected to.
If even that feedback is being stored,
right?
Because that is not a given. It's just you're basically just talking to the index that's just pulling information.
It's like saying, oh well, that photo is out of focus. Could I just fix that? It's well, we could. There's algorithmic sharpening, but the bits you've got are the bits you've got. You can't go back and refocus the camera.
Yeah.
If
I can hallucinate you some text on that paper.
Yeah. I could say, bump up edge contrast for me, and that feels like focus. It's more in focus, but you're still fundamentally limited. And I think in that sense, both in the large scale sense of here are the semantic entities that exist in this thing, and here's how they relate to each other, and I want these 6 things assembled together and treated as some new thing or whatever, whether it's at that level or it's down in the weeds of no, when I said doctor, I meant the verb, to go in and doctor something up, not to fix a disease. It's good at getting close,
Yeah.
But that ability to go in and say, oh no, I meant this, and to actually change what's there isn't how LLMs work. It's like it's this ongoing stream of connective stuff. And I think if we're to think about that, like what is the post AI world where this kind of thing is at least one of the tools in the toolbox? What do future CMSs and information management tools and automation tools or whatever, what are they going to have to do? I think having ways to sort of go up and down a level and manipulate those connective things in a way that makes sense to people is going to have to be part of that mix.
That can be that catch. Like, so the I think trying to manipulate the model is just super expensive, and I think it's
I'm sorry. I mean, when I said a model, I meant like the conceptual model that someone has of the domain or of the space, not necessarily like the language model getting retrained.
So I think probably a way to extract what structure is in the message that you're asking, then store that, retrieve it, present it, and then basically just CRUD on the underlying concepts.
When that isn't what you want to do, to be able to pop up a level and deal with it at like a different level of abstraction, where like you're not to sort of steal an old school context. It's like when, in the days of, early days of Drupal, when we discovered, we can just make CCK fields for everything and model our content or whatever. But then you very quickly ended up accumulating content models where people were trying to do something sufficiently complex. Making a page was actually this process of building and wiring together dozens of pieces of content individually with no way to really look at the thing you were making. And I think like that ability to deal with the atomic things where granular information lives, but then also to like pop up a level and work meaningfully with, but now I'm making this thing. I'm making an announcement. I need these 12 things as parts, and they need to be those meaningful atomic pieces in order to fit in with the system of meaning and interconnection or whatever. But like, I need to be able to go up and down a level in what I'm working with in order to work fluidly with it on a day-by-day basis. I going in and dealing with this media asset has this metadata associated with it versus this page happens to use that asset as part of what I'm doing are like two different levels of resolution almost in the content space. And like being able to work with both of those is a very tough challenge. And I think just papering that over with like, assistive tools that handle what's behind the scenes for you will solve a certain number of those problems. But like it's, and then the moment it doesn't, then you actually need ways to get in and work with what's under the hood in terms of the connective tissue of the concepts and the entities. And this is actually just a local shim for something stored in our CRM. You need to understand that, or you'll always get screwed by it because this is that semantic cache for something that lives over there. Like being able to navigate those boundaries, I think, is one of the hardest challenges, whether it's explicitly using AI tools or even just pure, assembly tools that a sufficiently large number of people have dumped content into over time.
I need to chew on this. I got a lot of new concepts.
Same here. I literally have ordered 2 books from Amazon just while we were talking. Always a pleasure. And, I think, I'm always down for, chewing on this stuff and talking through what you've got cooking, and I'm fascinated, and I know Karen is a big fan as well, and the degree of interesting conceptual overlap between the different kinds of stuff we do and chewing on is always a delight.
It is very, very much. I think that just the same way that, the rise of Dox's codes triggered the caused Netlify to become a big deal. Something similar is going to happen. There's a new CMS that's waiting to be made. It's just figuring out what is that CMS.
What is the emerging problem space and way of navigating it that is going to make a different paradigm blow up?
Yeah. No, but because that one was like, how do you interact? How do normal people interact with Git? Like, how do regular people,
GitHub? They log on to GitHub and they review a pull request or something.
Yeah, but even that's like, if you good luck asking your CEO to go and like approve your page that you're going to publish. Like that's why Netlify exists, so that you can.
Yep. So they can look at the new version and look at the old version and say, yes, rather than like looking at a markdown diff.
It's basically taking, well, as you said, it's like the new variant of the CMS. So I think there's a new CMS that's coming that's like an AI CMS. There's some questions from the Drupal. If I put on my Drupal hats, do we want to try to make that a Drupal kind of thing? But then we're going to have a whole bunch of dead constraints.
It's interesting because it feels like we're on the bleeding edge of starting to see the problems that actually need addressing in order to connect it to like meaningful impact. But I think it's still fuzzy enough that like it's hard to say what the emergent thing is going to be.
Like for example, one problem that is very, very universal is like a solution, I call it a solution portal, which is you as a customer of a company can go to this place where you can figure out how to solve the problem that you have. And then it uses a bunch of products, partner products, services, and then like compiles it into here's a recipe for dealing with your problem. I think that's something that's we see customers that have this. They've acquired a gazillion companies. It's a complete utter mess. Nobody has no clue about how it all fits together, and guiding people through that without having to even figure out an information architecture, but where you can just say, well, we have a database of solutions, and you can just ask a question, and it will come back with what you're looking for. That I think is a very, very interesting problem, and that would any larger company has this problem. But it's an interesting thing. Is do you use AI to just elevator you to the right place, to portal you to the right place? Is AI then your portal that like jumps you to where you have to go? Is AI the thing? Like, do you want to trust it to like compile stuff? You could do stick merging. Like you could like track what somebody else did and they liked it, and then say, well, this must be a good thing, so let's encode it that this is now a thing. So you could do stuff like that.
In some ways, it resembles is Google the new site structure? The question of like, is the search bar on your website the new sitemap? And I think the answer is sometimes, but abandoning the rigor that went into that turns out to harm the effectiveness of the search as a tool, because it having good stuff to find turns out to be related to the discipline of building out the structure too.
So I think that like the art of creating structures for a company, what you guys do, what y'all do, creating structures that an organization is going to use, and then using AI to populate those structures, and then maybe using AI to like find, and then some human in the loop process to validate that actually this is actually true, and then some way of retrieving those structured pieces of information. That should be very, very interesting. Well, right now, basically, what they're doing with graph, with a rank is we are just going to throw everything into the chunker.
We'll just chop it up into small enough pieces.
Yes, and it's going to be grand.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, you can do actually genomic sequencing works that way. Like when you just take a genome, just shoot it to pieces, and then just start like amplifying segments. That's what it does. So that does work. Like you can,
at least for certain kinds of problems. But is that a thing that works because that is how breaking down complexity works, or is it because that's how genes work?
Well, actually, what it does is that it allows you to understand what the structure is. So it allows you to break the problem down until you can then piece it together again, and then based on the pieces that you have, you can get to the full sequence. Super expensive. It does work for certain problems. I don't think it works for most problems that we actually care about. Like, I don't think we ever want to know like the body of all the, like trying to reconstruct what is actually going on in support. I don't think anybody cares. I think what we want is, can we extract meaningful information from what's happening here, classify it, like do vector embedding, and like figuring out which of these support requests look very similar, and then combine them into a piece of knowledge that gets encoded, verified that is actually true, and then becomes part of the approved set of content that then another LLM can go and play with to like answer the questions again. That I can imagine happening.
I think as a parting thought, at least, what fascinates me is like the closer to the metal you get of like, that kind of thinking. Like, it's not just you ask a natural language question and it responds in certain ways, but like actually thinking about, oh, okay, here is the kind of thing we want to capture as an n-dimensional spatial representation that can be matched for proximity with other things in different ways. I feel like the farther you get from how will LLMs solve this, and the closer you get to indexing is hard. And it's like, and I think that's where it really got me thinking about like LLMs are a giant semantic index.
Yeah.
And that does a lot of heavy lifting for us, but like fundamentally that's what's going on. Like, because once you start going down farther and farther, it's like, oh, well, I'm rebuilding Elasticsearch. It's like the boundary lines between those different kinds of approaches and tools start to get really blurry and become different areas of specialization in this fundamental problem of indexing and connecting, because I think that's a big part of what our challenge is. But
thank you very much, Jeff. Okay, bye.
Have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon.
See you soon. Bye.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com, and thank you for listening.